It's a pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today. By way of introduction, each story is unique. At the Breman Museum, we try to make sure that all of the stories of the rich culture of Europe are told. The majority of the Jewish population from Poland no longer exists. It was confined to largely the larger cities where there were large pockets of Orthodox Jewish community, and there was equally large numbers that were involved in all aspects of commerce and life throughout Europe. On the eve of the Nazi invasion, there was some 3 million Jews who lived in Poland. And following the summer of 1939, the pact with the Soviet Union to divide Poland, Germany invaded on September 1st, and World War II began. After heavy shelling and bombing, Warsaw surrendered to the Germans. And in the next month, Germany annexed the former Polish territories along the German border. Soon after, the Nazis set up a system of confining Jews to ghettos. By 1942, all the Jews of Poland were confined to ghettos, were living in hiding, or were on the run. And as we know, life became worse as the ghettos were liquidated and the occupants sent to concentration and death camps. A lucky few were able to remain in hiding or were found to possess some skills that the Nazis needed and found useful rather than sending them to slave labor or to the death camps. By the end of the war, it is estimated that 90% of the Jewish population of Poland was killed. And through this, though this remnant has survived, for the most part, there was nowhere to return to. The Jewish neighborhoods had been either destroyed or occupied. And in addition, there was no community left to support those that remained. As I gathered in the displaced persons camps, the majority looked to leave Poland for good. By 1950, the Jewish population of Poland was reduced to about 45,000 from 3 million. It is against this backdrop that George Rishfeld began his life born in Warsaw into a loving family just months before World War II began. George's life quickly changed as the family fled the Nazi onslaught, only to be put in the ghetto in Vilna. Confronting an unimaginable choice, George's parents made a very tough decision that you will hear on how to care for their son, faced with their own uncertain future. What I can tell you about our speaker today is that George is a kind and caring gentleman who has devoted so much of his time to make sure that the heroism of his protectors and the family is told as to as many people as possible. After the film, George will share a few remarks, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. And so now, my friends, it's a pleasure to share the story of George Rishfeld, who will then join us in just a moment. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
I used to start with tears in my eyes because I really didn't tell the story until about 1994. It was the first time I went public. But once I went public for a while and I realized I was comfortable with it, I feel that the world has to know, and if I have a room filled with 50 kids or 1,000 kids, it doesn't matter. My feeling is that if I reach one, I'm a winner. I was almost 2.5 years old when they did give me to the family and threw me over a barbed wire fence. Now, the reason they could throw me over a barbed wire fence at the time was because I was very small. When I was first born, I was 4.5 pounds. The gentleman that was Papa Franskevich to me was my father's foreman in the factory, and Halinka was my father's bookkeeper. So both of them worked for Dad. They had made this arrangement with them that if Mom did not survive and Dad did, they would return me to Dad. If the opposite happened, they would return me to my mother. If both of them did not survive, then they would officially consider me as their son and raise me, unfortunately or fortunately, raise me as a Catholic. I wasn't allowed to go out in the street. I wasn't allowed to play with anybody my age. I wasn't allowed to interact with anybody for that matter, all right? The people in the building, I think, knew I was there, but nobody managed to turn me in, which is kind of good because I'm here to tell the story. And the only time we did anything was we went outside in the evening so that I could get some fresh air. And the daughter, Halinka, is the one that took me for walks. We were out one night and we got stopped by a German patrol, and Halinka, being blonde and blue-eyed, very pretty, they started to flirt with her. And I can remember it well because I can see it in my mind's eye right now. The Nazi came and he pinched me on the cheek and he said, "Where's your mother?" And you have to understand that at that time I was also told not to speak a lot. So when I did speak, it came out kind of garbled. And they asked me where my mother was, and I said, well, she's in Polish. It came out, I was saying she's in the ghetto, but it came out so that it sounded like she's laying in the mud somewhere. And he thought I was being very funny, and he gave me an apple and told us to go back to the apartment. The Franskevich family took me to church on Sundays, and we would go to church. And one particular day, the Nazis were coming in. We heard the truck, and they were starting to come in, and Halinka knew that they were going to start looking for kids. So this one particular day, they came in, and Halinka told me, you know, grab your stomach, make believe you're sick, and if you can, start to cry. And I did that, and I grabbed my stomach, and I started to cry and everything. She picked me up, and we walked out. As we walked out, the Nazis were walking in, and we passed right by them, and they didn't say a word to us. So we got very lucky. Just as lucky as we got on the street when the Nazi gave me an apple. One of the things that I did really was, because I really couldn't, you know, didn't have any friends to play with or anything like that, was my room was the last room, and I would sit by the window, and across the street was an infirmary, a small little hospital, I guess. And the Nazis would be brought in, the ones that were wounded and so on, and they'd be brought in for repair. And I sat there and I killed them. And I think I killed about 10,000 Nazis, you know, with this finger. Because I would sit there and shoot them. To me, it was an adventure. The only thing that was missing and that I just didn't understand as to why was the fact that my parents weren't there. So I kept asking for my mommy and my daddy, you know, and the only thing they told me was, everything's going to be okay, everything's going to be okay, don't worry. It was Christmas Eve of '44 when my dad came to visit me, And I asked him, I said, where's mommy? Why don't you come with mommy? Because I didn't understand, the ghetto. I didn't understand that they were in a ghetto. I didn't know what a concentration camp was at the time. And he said to me, not to worry, she's fine, she'll be okay, and she's gonna see you soon. Well, I asked that question of my father maybe 25, 30 years later as an adult, and I said, do you remember that time on Christmas Eve in 1944? He says, I sure do. And I said, you told me that she was gonna be okay. What did you really think? And he said, well, I really thought she was dead. What my mother went through during the Holocaust has got to be a horrific time, but she got lucky. She was not sent to a labor camp, and she was not sent to a death camp. So she was in 2 different ghettos, and she survived because the ghettos that she was in, she was able always to work because she could sew. So she could work for the Nazis in sewing garments and making garments and things like that. And she had a horrible time. She just had a horrible time. She was, from an emotional standpoint, she had thought that God had abandoned her. Mom thought that Dad was dead, and Dad thought that Mom was dead. So the emotion was unbelievable, obviously. When they came to the apartment, it was like 10 New Year's Eves all in one moment. I mean, the fact that I saw the both of them together, it was quite a day. It was quite a couple of hours when I first saw them again together. Kids can be cruel sometimes. So the first couple of years were rough, and that's why I vowed that I would never have a foreign accent, and I would learn how to speak English like a New Yorker, because I was in New York, So it was tough the first couple of years, but I started to grow and I started to get strong, and things changed. I know I survived for a reason. I survived because the story has to be told, and I want to tell the story. So I intend to do that as long as people will listen.
George, we're going to bring George in now, but I want to thank everyone for seeing this brief introduction to George's life. There is so much more to the story. And what I'm going to ask is that if you saw some things, if you have some questions, if you'll type them in, I'll turn to those. I have one that's already been submitted, and we'll be compiling them and asking those of George, who's here. And I want to remind you that this is live, and anything you want, we will be able to ask given the time parameters. So, George, let me ask to fill in just a couple items right now. We see extensively what happened to your parents, but I want to ask a little more about the extended family. For you to, because your story is one of hiding and your parents of reuniting, and I'm going to ask you a question about that in a few minutes. But what happened to the rest of the extended family? Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, so that our viewers can understand what was happening throughout Poland.
There were only 2 people that survived. My brother, a kid brother of my mother's, and a kid brother of my father's. So my father's brother went to Siberia during the war, and he managed to survive in Siberia, Russia. Okay. My mother's brother left Poland in 1938, 1 year before the bombing. He was 18, and he went to Palestine, which obviously became Israel. And he became very, very, I wouldn't say wealthy, but he was well to do. Ended up being an architectural engineer, marrying a Sabra. As you know, that's a native born person. She was third generation Sabra, so they had a big family, raised a lot of kids, had grandchildren, and even helped build part of towns like Hadera and various different other parts because he was an architectural engineer, so he could do both the architectural part and the design part and the building part. And as a matter of fact, his famous thing that he's famous for, there's one golf course in all the whole country, and he helped build it in this area.
Wonderful, wonderful. Um, we know that while you were in hiding, that Halinka took very good care of you. But during the war, the Nazis continued to seek out families and children. And did you have any encounters with Nazis, near close encounters or directly with them?
Well, as you know, history tells us that Hitler had what he called the final solution. And the final solution was to kill as many children as possible because obviously children are the future. Okay. So he would send trucks around and to pick up children. And there would these trucks, what they would do is once they found Jewish children, they would throw the Jewish children into the truck and either kill them on the spot, take them to Dr. Mengele for experimental purposes, or depending on the age, take them to a labor camp. And again, depending on the age, just kill them because they're too young and so on. So one particular day, we're all in the apartment together. I remember it was a Saturday because everybody was there, the four of us. And all of a sudden, a truck stopped in front of the house. I didn't know what was going on. I was too young. Okay. So they told me, get under your bed. Now you have to understand this. The apartment was like what they call a railroad flat. It was a room after room after room. I was in the last room with Halinka, and there was a window there, and she had a bed. I had basically, they call it a bed, but it was like a cot. The mattress was about this thick. So they told me to get under the bed. I didn't know what was going on. To me, it was a game. So I got under the bed, and what they did is they drew the blanket down to the floor. So when you walk in and you're looking in, all you see is blanket. And they told me, don't move, don't blink, no matter what you hear, don't do anything. So I'm lying under the bed, and all of a sudden, I hear footsteps and chatter, and a blade comes through the mattress and touches my chin, doesn't break skin, just touches my chin and comes back out. Now, if that Nazi wasn't lazy and we'd have picked up that blanket, I wouldn't be here to tell you the story. So we got lucky, and I got really lucky. Now, keep in mind also that if they would have discovered me, the Franskeviches were dead. There was no such thing as saying, hey, Mr. Nazi, I didn't, not going to do this again. I'm sorry. It was a one-time thing. No, 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 no. They're just in as much danger. And by the way, just also, you know, babies, unfortunately, that were in diapers, they put them in dresser drawers and cover them. And unfortunately, they only survived 50% of the time because by the time the Nazis left, the baby suffocated anyway. So thank God I wasn't small enough to be put under into a dresser drawer, and I was big enough to be put under the bed.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. By the way, but that wasn't your only run-in with the Nazis. I know perhaps there's another story you've told before about when you're out in an apple.
Well, yeah, well, the apple, yeah. We were walking, Halinka would take me for walks. Now, keep in mind also, we're on the third floor of a four-story building, no elevator. So we had to walk up and down the stairs, obviously. But here's the thing. To this day, I don't understand why at night, when they took me out for walks, they would carry me. On Sundays, we went to church, they let me walk down the stairs. Now, think about this. 4 floors of apartments. I was there for almost 4 years. Nobody turned me in. The people in the building had to know that I was there. Halinka was too young to have a son my age, and they all knew each other anyway. And you know the Anne Frank story of in her in the attic, and then finally somebody turned her in. I didn't get turned in. So one particular day we're out in the street, and the Nazi patrol comes by, and the Nazi jumps out of his vehicle, and he looks at me, starts to flirt with Halinka, and he pinches me on the cheek. I can still feel that pinch. He says, "Where's your mother?" So you don't lie at that age. So I said, "She's in the ghetto." I didn't know what a ghetto was. It was a ghetto, it was a name. So, and the way I said it though, I slurred my words because I was still learning to make full sentences. It came out like she's lying in the mud somewhere. So he thought I was a comedian, pinched me on the cheek again, reached in his vehicle, gave me an apple, and slapped her on the rear end and said, "Keep walking."
Thank you. Thank you. Moving forward, we have a question from one of our viewers today who's been listening. How did your father survive? What did he do? Can you elaborate a little more upon what the movie was showing?
Okay. First of all, my parents made a pact at the beginning. Well, once the bombing started and everything, they told me this. Obviously, they made a pact that no matter what happens, they have to do whatever they can to make me survive, so that I survive. So they made this deal with this Franskevich family, and the Franskeviches, Mr. Franskevich was my father's foreman in my dad's factory. Mrs. Franskevich was a homemaker, and the Halinka was my father's bookkeeper. Okay. So no matter what happens, save the child. That was the whole key to my parents. That we ended up in the Vilna Ghetto, and they waited until now. The Vilna Ghetto was formed in 1941, although we went to Vilna in 1939. So they waited until I was out of diapers, so to speak. And what they did is they pact was save the child. Okay. So they did, they threw me over this fence into the arms of Halinka, and she whisked me off to their apartment in Warsaw. Okay. My parents now, 1941 to 1943, my dad and mom, my dad told me they made a pact together that one of them's got to make it, at least one of them. So since he was stronger and everything else, he escaped and joined a partisan group in the forest. Mom was left in the ghetto. Disbanding the ghetto in 1943 by the Nazis, they killed 95% of the people. My mother survived because of her face. Because what they did, they'd line you up, and if you looked healthy, they would keep you and maybe put you into a labor camp, which they did. Now, she didn't have any wrinkles, believe it or not. And the story goes is that my mom's mom, my great grandmother, used to rub her face with a cucumber every morning. So she didn't have any wrinkles. So she looked healthy, but from the neck down, she was not healthy. They put her in a camp called Kailis. And Kailis had a factory, a textile factory. And my mother knew how to handle a sewing machine. So she spent the rest of the war indoors, getting an extra cup of hot, stale water or something, an extra piece of bread maybe. And that's how she survived the war. My dad survived it being fighting in the forest.
Thank you. Thank you. Speaking of all of these early memories, one person asked, of all the things that you share, what is the earliest of all of these memories? You know, that you can say, I remember that distinctly, and how much is it of what was told to you?
Well, a lot was told to me about what happened in the ghetto. All right. As far as memories, some of the outstanding memories that I have is when my parents came to visit me. And when you want to talk about outstanding memory, which I think I should call Spielberg, and he should put this into a movie, because at the end of the war, mom was released by a bunch of Russians and put on a train platform to come, and she's coming to get me, thinking that my father is dead, and I survived, obviously, with the Franskeviches. So she's standing on this platform, and this is a mom story. She is in rags. I mean, she's in rags. She lost all kinds of weight, and she's anemic and everything else, and she looks terrible. She's standing on this platform, and she looks over to her right, and she sees this handsome guy in a Russian uniform with highly polished boots, clean shaven, and looking good. And she looks over and she says, "Richard," and then he says, "Lucy," and the two of them recognize each other. Now, think about this. They each thought the other one was dead. They ran and they grabbed onto each other for about 15 seconds. My mother then steps back, hauls off, and smacks my father across the face and says to him, "How dare you look so good? How dare you smell so good?" And he said, "Are you nuts? Did you go crazy?" And then they grabbed each other and they let go of each other. Obviously, then they both show up at the apartment and I went crazy. Okay. I just jumped on them and stayed there for a while.
Beautiful. Thank you. And that is one of your first memories, by the way, is that you are a witness because you remember all of these things.
Right. Right.
Obviously, not when you weren't with mom and dad. We've got a lot of questions. I'm going to jump around a little bit. Forgive me, but did you stay in touch? We've got a lot of people asking. Did you stay in touch with the family, with Halinka and the family? Have you? Is she still alive? So why don't you share with us
we
a
did
little more
stay.
about
We
that
did
story?
stay in touch with the family. We would send them packages. We also tried to get Halinka to come over, and she wouldn't, because by then she had. Don't forget, we came to this country in 1949. By the time we were settled, it was the 50s and so on, in the 60s, and the communist regime had taken over the area, and she was a marked lady. She was a marked woman because they had names of the people that were righteous Gentiles that would save Jewish lives. Her parents passed away in the 60s, Mr. and Mrs. Franskevich, who, by the way, are ultimately called Mama and Papa, by the way, when I lived with them. And then she got married. She had a son that she named after me and so on. And we would send packages. And for example, we'd send a box with 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, and 6 pairs of stockings, silk stockings. We get a letter back saying the pair of jeans and the 1 sweater is going to keep me warm all winter. Well, the communists would open up the boxes, take out 95% of the stuff, and then leave the rest for the recipient. Okay. We were happy she got a pair of jeans and a sweater. We didn't care really. She received something. Then my wife Pamela, who's an artist, she was studying weaving in Manhattan with a lady, and the lady was eventually became the head of the art department at Arizona State, but she was going to Poland on a grant where the Polish people are renowned. The weavers in Poland are renowned. So I had a ring that my parents bought me for my bar mitzvah, which was white gold. And I said to her, please take this ring with you, find Halinka, and give it to her for me. She did. We then found out that she sold it on the black market and got 9 months worth of money to buy food and clothing for her. So I was very happy. Okay.
That's amazing. Did you ever go back to visit? I mean, so you've talked about this where you kept in touch. One person has just a very specific question. Did you ever go back to visit? And I know you're often asked, do you have a desire ever to go back?
The short answer is no. Okay. But also you have to understand this. When we first came to this country, everything that was ingrained in my head, and I mean really banged into my head, was never go back, never go back, never go back. My parents were really insisting upon that. So I had that in my head. And quite frankly, I don't need to go back to see Auschwitz and see the ovens and see the crematoriums because I know too much. Okay. But I always said to myself, someday maybe. And then I have a wife that's pretty persistent. And she said, you have to go back to close the circle. And I said, no, I don't. So that went on for years. And then I finally said to Pamela, I said, you know what? I'll go back when I grow up. Well, 5 years ago or so, we went back. I felt like I've grown up. We went back. But we did not go to Poland. We went to Lithuania. We went to Vilnius because that's where my mother is from and my uncle is from Vilna. And that's where they went to school. So I met my cousins from Israel, my uncle's kids. We met in Vilnius and we spent time there. And then from there, I went back to Israel. Okay. So, but that story is interesting too, because we ended up going to the high school that my mother went to and my uncle went to. And we met a woman, 97 years old, that remembered my uncle and my mother. All right. And then we also went to the area where the displaced persons camp was in Lithuania that we went to after the war in Vilnius. And now it's a high rise, low end rental, you know, subdivision or whatever.
Amazing. I'm trying to keep the story flowing in the same direction. So I have a few once we get to displaced persons camp. But before we leave this part of the story for the moment, how did your dad actually escaped. Did he ever share any of the details about how he got out?
No, my dad was very close-mouthed about that. You know, Pop, did you ever kill anybody? George, why didn't you like that flower? No, that's one thing he could not talk about. I know there are stories. There's one particular story that I'd like to tell of that he did eventually tell me. He said he was in the forest one day and he found a woman leaning against a tree trying to breastfeed a child. And he walked up to her. He was heading back towards his encampment. And he said, "How can I help you?" And she said, "You can't. I'm waiting. Somebody's going to come here and pick me up or something." And he reached in his backpack and gave her, he had 2 loaves of bread in his backpack. Gave her 1 loaf and she said, "I can't take it." And he said, "What's the matter? Why can't you take it?" She said, "Because I can't pay you." He said, "I don't want money. Just take the bread. You need it." So then he reached in, got her the second loaf and gave her the second loaf of bread. And she still wouldn't take it. So finally she took off her ring, a ring that she had. And she said, "If you take this ring, I'll take the bread." And he took the ring. He put it on his pinky. He wore it for the rest of his life until he passed away. So, but I want to add one thing to this story, the displaced persons camp, to show you how lucky I've been. I started to play with children who were playing war. What else do you do as a kid then? Okay, you survived the war, you're going to kill more Nazis, right? So we were making believe killing Nazis. Picture this: bunch of rubble, a burnt out tank over here, buildings behind you. And we're going forward and shooting with our fingers. We're going to kill more Nazis. The kid standing next to me picks up what looks like a rock and he throws it and it blows up, hits him right here, kills him. He dies right next to me and I don't get a scratch. You want to talk about luck. The parents, can you imagine what these parents felt like? The kid survives the whole war. They survived the whole war. And this is how he dies playing a stupid game. They blame me that I instigated this whole thing. Obviously, it was a grenade that hadn't, it was just lots of rock and dust around it, and it looked like a rock. All right. And they blamed me. We were excommunicated from our building, from the apartment. We had to move. The people felt, the parents just went, I just can't describe how these parents acted.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. We actually have a lot of questions about your parents. I'm going to ask in a moment, but um, for the moment, when you come to America and you settle in, could you share some of the first experiences you remember as an immigrant child, going to school really for the first time in America? And I know you went to school and had some education in displaced persons camp, but really to have that what we would call a normal life at that point in America. Was it an easy transition? Were there some stories you want to share?
Well, first of all, I did get some education because after the war, we moved to Brussels for almost 3 years. So I went to school. My first schooling was in Brussels, and obviously it was in French. Everything was in French. Came to the United States. When I came to the United States, I was 10. And I went to school, and it was a horrible experience because number one, my mother's uncle who brought us over got us an apartment in an area called Murder Incorporated in Brooklyn. Very, very tough area at the time. And I'm going back now, 1949, 1950, you know, very tough area at the time. And also, we had a $25 a month flat. Can you imagine $25 a month of paying for rent? No heat and no air conditioning. So in the winter, there was enough condensation on the walls I could wash my hands. In the summer, I slept on the fireplace. Not fireplace, the fire escape. Okay. And first day in school was a disaster because my mother thought she was being very American. She dressed me in overalls. And I went to school in overalls, not speaking English. So that particular day was a disaster because whatever happened that day, they made fun of me because I don't speak English. But then I got beaten up in the schoolyard because I was a refugee. And that went on for several weeks until my father sat me down, had a long chat with me, and I fought back. And nobody's ever touched me ever since. Okay? And I vowed at that time, I'm going to learn to speak English, maybe with a little New York accent, but I'm going to learn to speak English so nobody's going to put a label on me again. Okay. And after that incident, and then it became much easier and so on. And then about a year into the United States, my wife, can you imagine if there are any educators out there, think about this. My wife, my mother went to the school and said, you know, my son is smart. You should skip him. You know what they did? They skipped me. So I ultimately graduated when I just turned 17. I graduated high school. I just turned 17.
Wow. Wow. And a lot of questions, again, I've said about your parents this time. Let's begin with what work did your parents find in the US?
Well, my father was a furrier. He had a fur shop, really a factory in Poland. He had a lot of employees, and they were very well off. And so when he came here, it's interesting that you asked me that question because he got a job 2 weeks into being in the United States, not speaking a word of English, but he got a job as in a fur shop. Now let's fast forward this incident. Let's fast forward a lot of years, and I'm dating a woman by the name of Pamela Kaplan. All right, and now we get engaged, and she said we're going to an affair. I don't remember if it was a bar mitzvah or a wedding or something like that. We're going to this affair, and you'll meet the rest of the family. And I said, oh, great. So we get to the affair, and she introduces me to Uncle Morris, and Uncle Morris says, "What's your name?" I said, George. No, no, no. What's your last name? I said, Rishfeld. What's your father's name? He said, Richard. What does your father do? I said, he's a furrier. He said, do you know that your father's first job in this country was for me, Morris Brothers Furs? So my father's first job in the United States was my future wife's uncle's business.
Wow. I've heard you speak many times. I don't think I knew that particular story. Um, so let's keep with that theme of family. What was family life um, after the war, immediately in Europe or later on? Many studies have been done about how that trauma affects individuals with parenting, what they share with their children. You already alluded to the fact that your dad didn't share much, but can you share and shed any light on how the trauma your family went through may have affected family life?
Well, my dad didn't share very much at all. It was like pulling teeth. Mom shared, but mom shared more with Pamela, my wife, than she shared with me. And the reason they didn't share in their minds was it would upset me. They were afraid to upset me and and so on. So okay, but that was the reality of it. Mom had a much harder time than Pop did because for the first 8 years she would not step into a synagogue. She felt that God had abandoned her. Dad obviously went to synagogue, and when I went with him in New York, he took his talit bag with the prayer shawl and everything. He took it and wrapped that in the New York Times. So in the street, nobody would recognize that he's wearing something that looks Jewish. And if he saw an NYPD blue cop, he'd cross the street for a lot of years, a lot of years. So there, and the other interesting part about that whole thing was that they could not assimilate and they did not have any American friends. They had all survivor friends. All of their friends and their whole clique or crowd, you might say, that they hung out with and socialized with were all people from Europe that had survived. And it was quite a crowd because it was like six couples. And what was most heartwarming thing about this whole thing is that you had a couple, the man lost his original wife, the woman lost her husband, and they met up after the war. During the war, they got together. So it was a mix, and all of them had lost children. I was the only child in the crowd that survived. Out of that whole crowd that my parents used to hang out with, so to speak, I was the only child that survived. And then my dad, after a number of years, he developed a fur business on 7th Avenue. And his partner was a survivor.
Um, are there any, someone wants to know, is there any accounts or recordings of your parents sharing their stories? Did they ever share it publicly?
They did not, unfortunately. At the time in the 50s and the 60s, there was a lot of bad stuff going around. For example, reparation money. A lot of people would receive checks from from the German government. We had a lawyer in New York that was a crook, a Jewish lawyer that was a crook. He said my mother didn't deserve anything. My dad got a check, I got a check, but my mother didn't. Well, what he did, we found out many years later, is he had all the money sent to him, and then he would dole it out. Well, he never got my mother. My mother never got his checks. So there was a lot of bad stuff going around in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s with that until a lot of people straightened it out. But they assimilated very well. My mother ended up working as a sales lady in one of the department stores, and dad had his business and so on. But still, as far as socializing was concerned, only with their own. You know.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Um, why did you? Well, let's jump ahead to this one. Why did you move to Atlanta? What brings you to us?
That's an easy question. Grandchildren, and children. Two daughters and grandchildren.
How many grandchildren?
Well, when we moved here, there were four. Now there's six.
Wonderful, wonderful. While we're on a light subject, actually, someone really wanted to see what kind of New Yorker you are. Do you have a favorite Jewish food or anything from New York?
A square potato knish and a
Very,
good corned beef sandwich.
don't we all love that?
Yeah.
Of all the things, let's talk about you for a moment. Of all the things that have happened to you in the past, what's made you the person that you are? Do you credit, excuse me, your experience with the Holocaust and after the Holocaust coming to America? How has it really influenced who you are today?
I think I give all the credit. I give all the credit to my father, and a lot of credit to my mother too. But I had a special bond with my father, and the bond was not so much father son; it was more friend and very close bond. So he taught me that your handshake is worth more than your signature. Mom taught me that the glass is not half empty; it's half full. Um, they also taught me the good things to think about, and there's enough junk in the world today. You don't want to add to the junk as well. So be a person that's going to give as opposed to a person that's going to receive. And I just had the right upbringing as far as I'm concerned. I mean, they set the tone. They really set the tone. Every night we had dinner together, no matter what happened. The family sat at the dinner table together. Dad would come home, and we would all wait for him, and we would have dinner together. It was a different world at the time, and they had so much pain that they went through that they didn't want to sort of send those vibes to me. So they kept me in a very positive mode to the extent where you can do whatever you set out to do, you can do it. And ultimately, that's been my life. I mean, that's been my philosophy.
Thank you. Um, what made you want to tell this story? You started telling this in the mid 90s. And what was the impetus for wanting to start sharing this painful story in your life?
There's too much anti-Semitism going on today, as always. There are too many non-believers out there, and I feel that the story has to be told, and it has to be told over and over and over again because people have a very short memory when it comes to tragedy. People forget too fast. And so it has to be told, especially to the younger generation, because the younger generation is the generation that's going to hopefully prevent another mass murder happen again. There are still lots of little Holocaust going on today. There's a lot of murdering going on today. But the story has to be told as to what we all went through. And we're going to disappear in the next decade or two, in the next decade because we're all getting too old. So the younger generation has to take over. And if they're not going to take over, nobody's going to know. And if nobody knows, what does that mean to me? It means you need more education. If you're not educated, and if the kids are not educated about what happened then, it'll be a loss. And it'll be a loss for generations. And that's what I'm trying to prevent. And hopefully, My philosophy is if when I do speak, if I reach one person, I've done my job.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And I think with that answer, you really addressed a really important question that someone asked is that how should we assure that people know this part of history and what are the best ways to teach and maintain awareness of this topic? And I think I don't know if you want to elaborate specifically upon
Well,
that question.
the education system in this country is a lot to be desired. And they have to start, unfortunately, they're teaching the Holocaust to fifth and sixth graders. That's too young of an age. You have to start with the seventh, eighth, and ninth grade. And you can't just do it one semester. You have to continue doing it because the horrific time that happened between 1935 and don't forget Hitler started in 1933 when he became chancellor. All right. So he started with those concentration camps in 1933, 1934, only they weren't killing camps at the time. They became killing camps after 39. All right. So there are people out there that say that was a Hollywood myth. Can you imagine that? There are people that say Spielberg made it up. Well, give me a break. All right. The Nazis were so adamant about recording everything. They recorded everything. There are pictures, there's written data, and so on. So who's going to tell me that that never happened? All right. And the story has to be told. It has to be told over and over again until people finally say, yes, let's not have to have it again.
Thank you very much. We're down to our final question, George, actually. And if I can share this a little bit with you, but a question is, do you give talks to high school students? And if on behalf of the Bremen, if I could follow your response, but do you give talks to high school students?
I give talks to anybody that'll listen to me. And yes, I give talks to high school students. Yes.
Very good. And I would want to say to all of
And
our
to churches, and to churches, and to army bases. Anybody that'll let me speak, I will speak to.
thank you very much. And what I would follow up with is that for anyone who is watching, George, the Breman Museum would be happy to arrange an opportunity for you to speak to a group, as well as so many of our survivors, as well as even though our museum is closed to visitors these days, that we have an online tour that we will give to groups. We offer it Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and on Fridays we are offering survivor speakers. You are one of them, to schools out in the community that, as with everyone, we've had to rethink our modality of teaching. But this, as you have taught us today, is such an important topic that we want to make sure that it is brought out. And so all anyone needs to do is to go to our website and to go to our education page, and we will reply, and we will be happy to schedule a tour or a speaker as we've talked about. So, George, I want to say if there's any last words you want to say before I give a closing
The only
closing
thing,
remarks.
yes, the only thing I'd like to say lastly is I will speak to two people. I will speak to one person. It doesn't matter what the crowd is, but also to the young people out there, get an education. Please get yourself educated. Read a book. Turn the TV off for an hour, just an hour, and pick up a book about anything. But be educated, understand what's going on, and be able to make your own decisions, not what the media is telling you to decide about. Make your own decisions. And thank you very much.
George, on behalf of the Bremen, but on behalf of all of the audience who's tuned in today, I want to thank you for taking the time as you do each and every time that you share your story. We hope that everyone who is watching will take just a moment to fill out the brief survey that you're going to receive so that we can continue to bring these stories to you. We will continue to be bringing these on a monthly basis, so check back to the Bremen website that we can share those stories while we're closed down. And once we are all able to venture out, we hope that you will visit the Bremen Museum again. In the interim, we have plenty of online Zoom and virtual programming, and we hope that you will join us for something soon. Thank you all, and thank you, George, for giving us your time. Thank you. We'll talk to you soon.